A workman's diary, written 4,500 years ago, was pulled out of a cave on the Egyptian coast of the Red Sea. And inside it, in faded red and black ink, is something that shouldn't exist. A day-by-day logbook written by a man who helped build the Great Pyramid. Not a legend written centuries later. Not a priest's story about gods. An actual foreman named Merer recording his crew's daily work while the pyramid was still rising above the desert. He wrote down where the stones came from, how they were moved, how long each trip took. And what he described is not what you were taught in school. Because Merer's crew wasn't dragging stones across the sand under the whip of a slave master. They were sailing them through a network of engineered canals, man-made harbors, and water basins that reached almost to the foot of the pyramid itself. A transport system so advanced that when archaeologists finally mapped it, some of them refused to believe the dating. For 200 years, we were told the pyramids were a brute force mystery. 100,000 slaves, wooden rollers, endless suffering. That story is wrong. The real story is stranger. The Egyptians had a technology, a complete, tested, engineered system for moving millions of tons of stone. And piece by piece, over the last few decades, archaeologists have dug it out of the ground. A ramp machine carved into a desert quarry that violates everything we assumed about ancient hauling. A physics trick painted on a tomb wall that scientists only verified in a laboratory in 2014. And most recently, evidence that the Egyptians may have been using water itself as a lifting force, with dams and channels built into the desert 1,000 years before anyone thought such engineering existed. 3 discoveries, 3 pieces of a lost machine. And when you put them together, the picture that emerges is not a primitive civilization getting lucky. It's an industrial operation. Let's start with the diary, because everything begins there. In 2013, a French archaeologist named Pierre Talat was excavating a series of man-made caves at a site called Wadi El Jarf on Egypt's Red Sea coast. The caves had been sealed with heavy stone blocks. Behind them, his team found hundreds of papyrus fragments. When they were pieced together, Talat realized he was holding the oldest inscribed papyri ever discovered anywhere on Earth. And they weren't prayers. They weren't spells. They were paperwork, accounting records, delivery schedules. And the logbook of Inspector Merer, the leader of a work gang of roughly 160 men, dated to the 27th year of the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh of the Great Pyramid. Merer's entries read like a trucking manifest. His crew loaded fine white limestone at the quarries of Tura on the east bank of the Nile. They sailed the blocks across the river and through a canal system to a place the logbook calls the Horizon of Khufu. That was the ancient name of the Great Pyramid. The round trip took a few days. They did it over and over, month after month, during the flood season when the water ran high. Read that again. They sailed the stones to the pyramid. Not dragged, sailed. Which raises an obvious problem. The Great Pyramid sits on a desert plateau. The Nile is kilometers away. How do you sail a boat full of multi-ton stone blocks to a building site in the middle of the desert? For years, that question hung in the air. Then, archaeologists started digging around the base of the Giza plateau, and the answer came out of the ground. Buried under the modern city, they found the remains of harbor basins, dock installations, the traces of channels that once carried Nile floodwater right up to the edge of the plateau. Core samples drilled deep into the sediment confirmed it. 4,500 years ago, when the flood came in, water reached the foot of Giza. The Egyptians hadn't fought the desert. They had rerouted a river into it. Merer wasn't describing a miracle. He was describing infrastructure. And his logbook even mentions the man running it all. A high official named Ankhayef, Khufu's own half-brother, described as the overseer of the great works. Not a god, not a magician, a project director. This is the first thing the diary destroys. The idea that the pyramid was built by an unorganized mass of slaves. What Merer describes is a professional workforce, rotating crews, supply chains, scheduled deliveries. And when archaeologist Mark Lehner excavated the workers' town near the pyramids, a site called Hayt el Ghurab, he found the proof in the ground. Bakeries, breweries, dormitories, enormous quantities of cattle and fish bones. These men were fed like athletes. They were paid, housed, and organized into named teams that scrawled graffiti inside the pyramid boasting about their gangs. The Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure. Slaves don't leave graffiti bragging about their team spirit. And the scale of the operation Merer belonged to keeps growing the more we dig. Wadi el Jarf itself, the site where his diary was found, turned out to be a purpose-built harbor complex on the Red Sea, complete with storage galleries, anchors, and the remains of boats. The oldest artificial harbor ever discovered on Earth, constructed as part of the same national logistics network that fed the pyramid. Khufu's Egypt wasn't just building a tomb. It was running ports on 2 coasts, copper mining expeditions across the sea to Sinai, quarry operations spread over hundreds of kilometers, and a river fleet tying it all together. The pyramid was simply the center of the web. But here's the thing. The water system explains how the stones reached the plateau. It doesn't explain what happened next. Because once a 2.5-ton block is sitting on the dock, you still have to move it across the sand, and then you have to lift it. 200 meters of hauling, 146 meters of climbing. And this is where the second discovery comes in. The one that was hiding in plain sight, painted on the wall of a tomb for almost 4,000 years. In a tomb at a site called Deir el-Bersha, there's a famous wall painting of a colossal statue being moved. The statue belongs to a governor named Jehutihotep, and it's being dragged on a wooden sled by 172 men. Nothing unusual there. That's exactly how we assumed the Egyptians moved heavy loads. Rope, sled, muscle. But look closer at the front of the sled. There's a single figure standing on the prow, and he's pouring water onto the sand directly in front of the sled's runners. For more than a century, Egyptologists dismissed him. They called it a ritual, a ceremonial purification of the path, a symbolic gesture for the gods. He was labeled decoration and ignored. Then, in 2014, a team of physicists at the University of Amsterdam decided to actually test it. They built a laboratory version of an Egyptian sled, loaded it with weight, and dragged it across sand. Dry sand behaved exactly as expected. It piled up in front of the sled runners, creating a berm of resistance that made hauling brutal. Then they added water. Not a flood, a precise amount, just enough to bind the grains together. The sand stiffened, the berms stopped forming, and the force needed to pull the sled dropped by as much as half. The study was published in Physical Review Letters, one of the most rigorous physics journals in the world. The conclusion was unavoidable. The man pouring water on the sand wasn't performing a ritual. He was operating the system. The Egyptians had discovered a principle of granular physics, the precise moisture content that minimizes sliding friction in sand. And they had it so thoroughly worked out that they painted the technique into their tombs as standard procedure. With wet sand hauling, the same block needs half the men, which means the same workforce moves twice the stone. Multiply that across 2.3 million blocks, and this one detail rewrites the entire labor mathematics of the Great Pyramid. They weren't guessing, they were recording. And for 100 years, we looked directly at the instruction manual and called it religion. That's the second piece of the machine. Water to float the stones to the site. Water to slide them across the ground. But the third piece is the one that stopped archaeologists cold. Because sliding a block horizontally is one problem, raising it 14 stories into the sky is another. And in 2018, in a remote quarry deep in Egypt's eastern desert, a joint French and British team found something carved into the rock that no one had ever seen before, anywhere. If you're enjoying this investigation into what the ancients actually knew, hit subscribe because the deeper we dig into these discoveries, the stranger the story gets. The site is called Hatnub. It's an ancient alabaster quarry southeast of Cairo, and it was worked during the exact period the Great Pyramid was being built. The team, led by Yannis Gordon of the French Institute for Oriental Archaeology and Roland Enmarch of the University of Liverpool, was there to study inscriptions. What they found instead was a machine. Cut directly into the quarry rock was a ramp, but not the kind of ramp anyone expected. Every reconstruction of pyramid building had assumed Egyptian ramps were gentle, because dragging multi-ton stones up anything steeper than about a 10% slope was considered physically impossible for human haulers. The Hatnub ramp climbs at more than 20%, double the assumed maximum, steep enough that a loaded sled should have been unmovable, except the ramp didn't work alone. Flanking it on both sides, the team found 2 carved staircases, and running up those staircases, dozens of post holes cut into the rock, sockets for thick wooden posts anchored beside the ramp. Here's how the system worked. The stone block sat on a sled in the center. Ropes ran from the sled up and around the wooden posts, then back down to teams of haulers standing below on the staircases. The posts acted as anchor points, redirecting the pulling force. Some of the men pulled from above, others pulled downward from below, using their own body weight, letting gravity work for them instead of against them. The posts functioned as a force multiplier, a primitive but genuine mechanical system for hauling loads up slopes that should have been impossible. Gordon said it plainly. This kind of system has never been discovered anywhere else, and the inscriptions surrounding the ramp date it to the reign of Khufu. The same king, the same generation, the same engineers. Think about what that means. At the exact moment the Great Pyramid was rising, Egyptian work crews were operating a rope and post hauling machine that modern archaeologists didn't even know existed until 2018. If they used this system at a remote alabaster quarry, what were they using at Giza, the most important construction site in the ancient world? Suddenly, the old objections start to collapse. The pyramid's biggest engineering nightmare was never the 2.5-ton limestone blocks. It was the granite. Above the king's chamber, deep inside the pyramid, sit massive granite beams, weighing 50 to 80 tons each. They were quarried at Aswan, 800 kilometers to the south, floated down the Nile, and then raised dozens of meters into the heart of the structure. For decades, skeptics pointed at those beams and said no ramp system could explain them. The Hatnub discovery doesn't fully solve that problem, but it proves the toolbox was bigger than we thought. Steep ramps, anchored posts, counterweight hauling, staircase crews. And evidence from other sites fills in more. At a small early pyramid called Sinki, archaeologists found 4 construction ramps still in place, one against each face, abandoned mid-project. Frozen evidence that the Egyptians ran multiple ramps simultaneously, adapting the system as the structure rose. The picture forming is not one ramp, one method, one trick. It's an evolving engineering discipline, and you can actually watch them learning. Drive south of Giza to Dashur and look at the bent pyramid. It starts climbing at a steep angle, then abruptly changes slope halfway up, giving it its strange bent silhouette. That's not a design choice. That's a correction. The builders detected structural problems mid-construction, recalculated, and changed the angle on the fly. The Pyramid Age wasn't a miracle. It was an iterative engineering program complete with failures, revisions, and breakthroughs, compressed into about a century. And the same king who built the bent pyramid, Sneferu, Khufu's father, didn't stop. He corrected his mistake and immediately built another one, the Red Pyramid, the first true smooth-sided pyramid in history, at a safer angle. One man's reign contains the entire learning curve, failure, and mastery, standing a few hundred meters apart in the same desert. By the time his son Khufu broke ground at Giza, the engineers weren't experimenting anymore. They were executing. That's why the Great Pyramid's base is level to within just a couple of centimeters across, 13 acres, and why its sides align to true north with an accuracy that some surveys place within a 20th of a single degree. Precision like that doesn't come from brute force. It comes from accumulated method, from a generation of builders who had already made every mistake somewhere else. But it's at Dashur that the story takes its strangest turn. Because, sitting in the desert near the Red Pyramid, are two massive ancient structures that archaeologists walked past for 100 years. They were labeled construction ramps, filed away, forgotten. And then someone looked at them again and realized they may not be ramps at all. The two structures run across a desert valley, a wadi, upstream of the Dashur pyramids. For a century, the assumption was simple. Big, linear mounds near pyramids, they must be leftover construction ramps. But in a recent analysis, researchers noticed something wrong with that label. Ramps run toward a construction site. These structures run directly across the valley, anchored into the hillsides on both ends. That's not the geometry of a ramp, that's the geometry of a dam. And one of the two structures has a feature that made hydraulic engineers sit up. Its crest isn't straight, it zigzags. In modern dam engineering, that zigzag design has a name: a duckbill spillway. It's a specialized overflow structure still used today, because folding the crest into a zigzag dramatically increases its length, letting the dam safely release far more floodwater than a straight edge of the same width. No confirmed spillway of that type had ever been documented in ancient Egypt. If this interpretation holds, a 4,000-year-old structure in the Egyptian desert contains one of the earliest known examples of advanced spillway engineering anywhere on Earth. And the implications go far beyond flood control. A dammed, regulated water supply in the desert valley above a pyramid site means stable canals. It means barges and water-assisted sleds moving stone over flat ground. It means water for tens of thousands of workers, for mixing mortar, for the entire industrial ecosystem of a pyramid project. The researchers put it in one haunting sentence: other hydraulic structures are most probably lost in the desert, waiting to be identified as such. And some scientists want to push the idea even further. In 2024, a multidisciplinary team led by engineer Xavier Landreau published a study on Egypt's very first pyramid, the Step Pyramid of Djoser, at Saqqara, arguing that a nearby stone enclosure, long dismissed as unfinished, may have functioned as a check dam, feeding water through a series of treatment basins and into shafts beneath the pyramid itself. Their most radical proposal: that water raised inside an internal shaft could have been used to help float and lift stones through the core of the structure. A hydraulic elevator, 4,500 years ago. Mainstream Egyptology pushed back hard on that last claim. And honestly, the criticism is fair. There's no direct textual evidence for hydraulic lifting, and the water volumes required are debated. But notice what nobody is disputing anymore. The canals were real, the harbors were real, Merer's boat deliveries were real. The question is no longer whether the pyramid builders were hydraulic engineers. The question is only how far their mastery of water went. And that is a question archaeology has barely begun to answer. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about Old Kingdom Egypt. We have the pyramids, we have the quarries, we have one foreman's logbook that survived by pure luck in a sealed cave on a distant coast. And almost nothing else. No architectural plans have ever been found, no engineering manuals, no design documents for the largest building project of the ancient world. Either they never existed, which is hard to believe for a civilization this obsessed with record keeping, or they were written on papyrus, stored near the sites, and rotted away thousands of years ago. Which means the knowledge itself, the actual engineering science of the Pyramid Age, is a lost library. We're not reconstructing their methods from their explanations. We're reconstructing them from crumbs. A ramp in a quarry, a painting on a wall, a diary in a cave. And every crumb we find shows a civilization more capable than the one we imagined. Even their hand tools tell that story. For years, skeptics claimed copper tools couldn't have cut the pyramid stone, and pointed to that as proof of a missing technology. So, an experimental archaeologist named Deanie Stocks spent over 20 years actually testing it. He rebuilt the tools from tomb paintings and surviving examples, copper saws, copper drills, and put them to work on real Egyptian stone. The result surprised everyone. The copper wasn't doing the cutting at all. The Egyptians fed quartz sand into the cut, and the sand, harder than the stone itself, did the work while the copper blade simply carried it. A flat copper saw with sand abrasive slices through granite. Slowly, brutally, but it works, and it leaves precisely the kind of tool marks found on pyramid-era stonework. Once again, the answer wasn't a lost machine. It was a lost method. Simple materials, arranged with an intelligence we failed to credit. A team of physicists from the Scan Pyramids project placed particle detectors around and inside the Great Pyramid. Not radar, not sonar. Muon detectors. Instruments that track cosmic ray particles falling from the upper atmosphere. Muons pass through solid rock, but stone absorbs some of them. So by counting the particles that make it through, you can map empty spaces inside a structure you cannot enter. It's like taking an X-ray of a mountain. Above the Grand Gallery, deep in the pyramid's core, the detectors found a void. Enormous, at least 30 meters long, roughly the size of the Grand Gallery itself, sealed inside the masonry, with no known entrance, no corridor leading to it, no mention in any text. The finding was published in Nature, confirmed independently by 3 separate detection technologies, and it remains unexplained. Some Egyptologists believe it's a relieving space, a structural feature to shed weight from the chambers below, which would itself be a revelation about the builder's engineering. Others think it may be a construction feature, the remnant of an internal ramp or staging gallery, sealed as the pyramid rose around it, which would mean part of the machine we've been searching for is still inside the pyramid, entombed in the one place archaeology cannot easily reach. 4,500 years after completion, the building is still keeping secrets from us. And no one has seen inside that space. Not one human being in 45 centuries. Now, does all of this prove the most extreme version of the story? Machines we can't imagine? Lost sciences, technology beyond their era? Probably not. And it's worth slowing down here, because the skeptical version of this story deserves to be heard. Everything discovered so far fits within human capability. The wet sand technique is clever, but it's rope, wood, and water. The Hatnub ramp is ingenious, but it's carved stone and post holes. The canals are impressive, but Egypt was a river civilization. Managing water was their entire existence. The workforce estimates, refined by Lehner's excavations, suggest perhaps 20 to 30,000 workers, not the 100,000 of legend. Well-fed, well-organized, rotating seasonal crews of farmers working during the flood months when their fields were underwater anyway. Given 20 years, that workforce, with these methods, could plausibly place the required stone every few minutes of every working day. The math is tight, but it works. No aliens required. No lost super-civilization. But here's what the skeptics sometimes miss. That explanation isn't smaller than the myth. It's bigger. Because a miracle requires no organization. A god requires no logistics. What the evidence describes instead is a state that could design a multi-decade industrial project, feed and house a city of workers, run a national supply chain stretching 800 kilometers, re-engineer the flow of the Nile itself, and coordinate all of it without money, without iron tools, without the wheel in any practical hauling role, and without a single surviving blueprint. 4,500 years ago, someone stood on the Giza plateau with the entire system in their head. the harbor schedules, the quarry outputs, the ramp configurations, the water levels, the food supply, and it worked. The building stood. It's still standing. It was the tallest structure built by human hands for nearly 4,000 years, and nothing we've constructed since has lasted as long as it already has. So, what does it mean if this picture is true? It means the story of civilization needs an edit. We tend to draw human progress as a straight line rising from primitive to modern, with ourselves at the top. But the pyramid evidence describes something else, a peak, a moment when organizational and engineering knowledge surged to an extraordinary height, and then, within a few generations, receded. The kings after Khufu built smaller, then cruder. Later pyramids collapsed into rubble mounds because the internal engineering was inferior. Whatever the Fourth Dynasty engineers knew, their successors knew less of it. Knowledge, real technical knowledge, was lost inside Egypt itself, within centuries of the Great Pyramid's completion. And if an entire engineering discipline could rise and vanish inside one civilization's own history, you have to ask the final question. What else worked like that? How many other techniques, systems, and sciences flickered into existence in the ancient world, functioned brilliantly, and then disappeared, leaving behind only the monuments they built and no explanation of how? We found Merer's diary because a storm of sand sealed a cave for 4,500 years. One cave, one foreman, one lucky excavation. The rest of the paperwork of the Pyramid Age, the plans, the calculations, the manuals, is still out there somewhere, or gone forever. The Hatnub ramp sat in an open quarry, visible, uncovered, for 45 centuries before anyone understood what they were looking at. The Dashur dams were mislabeled for 100 years. The water technique was painted on a tomb wall the entire time. The evidence was never hidden. We just didn't know how to see it. Tonight, the Great Pyramid stands over Cairo the way it has stood over everything. Over the Romans, over the pharaohs who came after, over every empire that rose and fell in its shadow. Beneath the streets at its feet, the old harbors are still down there, silted and buried, holding the shape of a river the Egyptians moved by hand. Somewhere under the desert, more of their machine is waiting. Uncounted, unrecognized, still sealed under the sand. And the men who understood all of it, the ones who could have simply told us, have been silent for 4,500 years. If you want to see what else the ancient world left buried, watch the next investigation on screen now.